Good day. Before I proceed with this video, this is just a few household matters. Firstly, after some discussion, we have decided to resume broadcasting on YouTube. We did for the Duran. You can see our latest live stream there, which we broadcast and completed today. Secondly, we continue to be present on all other platforms. The Duran, Alexander Mercouris and Alex Christoforou. You can find our channels on a multiplicity of platforms. We are specifically on Rumble. You can find us on Rumble. If you type our names into the search bar, that will take you directly to whichever of our channels you choose to watch. If you watch a video on one of our videos on Rumble from any of our channels, if you see the red maroon button at the top of the video, that will take you directly to Locals, where of course we have our community and where I do regular live streams every Wednesday. I did a long and informative one, I think, yesterday, and obviously I will continue to do so every Wednesday. And you can, of course, if you choose to join our community, comment yourself, publish your own content, join the live stream, and participate actively in the work that we do. So let's now proceed to the events of today. Now, I am not very up to date with military situations. I've just actually seen reports of a Pentagon briefing, or at least what appears to have been a Pentagon briefing, which is in the Financial Times. It speaks of the Russians steadily tightening their control on the coastal city of Mariupol and perhaps making advances towards Odessa, all in the Black Sea coast. They are also supposedly approaching more closely the center of the city of Kharkiv, though it's important to say that the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said today that there are no Russian troops in Kharkiv itself, and as far as I could tell, he appeared to deny that there ever had been, at least in any sustained way. As for this 40-kilometer convoy of military vehicles that are poised to strike outside Kiev, the Pentagon says that it hasn't moved for several days. It's still located some distance from the city. The Pentagon speculates that it's held up by supply issues. Seems to me it's much more plausible that what is holding the Russians back is the fact that today negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians resumed in Belarus. And that is, in a sense, the topic of the discussion today. Now, I'm going to make here one quick observation, which is that this is a war which Russia is waging. It's not a war which the West is waging. And Westerners, I think, often assume that Russians wage war in exactly the same way as they would do. So, as has been pointed out by several people, by many people, the Russians have not carried out the kind of saturation bombing of cities and infrastructure that we saw, for example, in 2003 at the time of the US invasion of Iraq. They have acted in a much more incremental and I might even say low-key way. And also, and this I think is important, they have not so far sought to storm those cities, those Ukrainian cities which they have encircled. They have apparently completed or effectively completed their encirclement of the Ukrainian army in the Donbass, but they have not sought to storm the cities and have so far made no attempt to do so. Moreover, this is consistent with certain things they said right at the outset of their operation, which is that it is targeted at Ukraine's military infrastructure and armed forces. It's not targeted at civilians. Now, one should treat comments like that with extreme cynicism, but in fact, there is an obvious reason why the Russians are not storming the big cities, are not storming Kiev itself, and I've touched on it in previous programs, and that is that they want to conduct negotiations with the Ukrainian government in order to achieve some kind of solution to this conflict, which will be a solution which will be agreed by the other government. If that is the intention, then it becomes clear why the offensive, the strike against Kiev, is not taking place. Because by definition, the Russians want that government to continue to exist so that they can negotiate and agree a deal with it. Now, I said at the beginning that Westerners don't always understand the Russian view of war. In the West, we tend to see war and peace as alternatives, as things that when one happens, the other stops. We also tend to see diplomacy and military combat as somehow opposites too. So the assumption is that when the fighting begins, the diplomacy ends until one side or the other is prepared to come to terms and to surrender. The idea that one should conduct both diplomacy and military action at one and the same time is not one, I think, that we generally understand or practice. And here I think I have to say that this is, by contrast, very much the Russian way, and it has its roots far back into the 19th century, but it's also, I think, reflective of the great influence of the German theorist Clausewitz on Russian military thinking. He is apparently very much someone whose ideas, which were repackaged for the Soviet military by Friedrich Engels, it seems that his ideas that war is an extension of politics and of diplomacy is something which the Russians have very much internalized, and they don't make these rigid distinctions between diplomacy and conflict, which we do. On the contrary, they see military action as, in a sense, a way of conducting diplomacy, which is not, I think, something we understand. However, if you approach it in that way, then many of these Russian actions begin to make sense. Specifically, their failure or their decision not to launch a direct offensive on Kiev, to storm Kiev, given, as I said, that they want to negotiate with the government there, and storming Kiev contradicts that objective. Anyway, having engaged in that little lecture, perhaps I can proceed with some of the events of today, some of the diplomatic events of today. Now, various important Russians have been speaking. There's been comments by the intelligence chief, Sergei Narishkin. There's been a long press conference by Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. There's been an interview by Sergei Ryabkov, the Russian deputy foreign minister. I'm going to come to Lavrov in a moment, but perhaps the most interesting meeting, or rather discussion, came from the most important man in the Russian political hierarchy, who is of course Vladimir Putin himself. And Vladimir Putin had another of his long telephone calls with French President Macron. Now, the Russian presidential website, where I usually go to for my readouts, is at the moment inaccessible because of DOS attacks. But the Russian Interfax news agency, which I would stress is private and completely independent of the Russian government, has a lengthy excerpts from that readout. In fact, I'm going to say that I think it probably sets out pretty much its entirety. And I'm going to take this from Interfax, and this is what Interfax says. A frank discussion of the situation around Ukraine was continued during a telephone conversation on Thursday between Russian President Vladimir Putin and his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron. Frank, by the way, shows that there were some strong words exchanged. And then the Interfax version of the Kremlin readout reads as follows. Putin set out in detail the principled approaches and conditions in the context of the talks with Kiev's representatives. It was confirmed that the talks focused primarily on the demilitarization and neutral status of Ukraine so that no threat would ever emanate from its territory to the Russian Federation. It was stressed that the objectives of the special military operation will be fulfilled in any way, and that attempts to play for time by dragging out the talks will only lead to our, let's say Russia's, negotiating position, presenting Kiev with further demands. It was especially emphasized that during the special operation, which is going to plan, the Russian armed forces are doing everything possible to preserve the lives of peaceful citizens. Precision weapons are only being used to destroy military infrastructure. Allegations of rocket attacks and bombardments of Kiev and other Ukrainian sister cities are inconsistent with reality and elements of the anti-Russian disinformation campaign. Putin reaffirmed the readiness of the Russian side for interaction with its foreign partners for the purposes of resolving acute humanitarian problems and called on the President of France to join efforts to ensure the safe withdrawal of foreign citizens from Ukraine. Thus, he mentioned a large group of Indian students in Kharkiv who are effectively being held hostage by Ukrainian forces. Emmanuel Macron promised to do the relevant work with Kiev's leadership. Putin commented in detail on Macron's address to the nation yesterday regarding the war in Ukraine, having disagreed with many of its theses. In particular, Emmanuel Macron called Russia's fight against the extreme right. He used the readout uses a stronger word relating to a political movement which was current in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, in Ukraine, a lie. Well-grounded explanations were given regarding the considerable role of members of this movement in Kiev's state policy. It was noted that during its special operation to protect Donbass, Russia intends to continue its uncompromising fight against militants from nationalist armed organizations who commit war crimes. These included putting military equipment in residential areas and using the civilian population as human shields. Putin also noted that Macron's statement did not say a single word about the Ukrainian leaders having sabotaged the Minsk agreements for 7 years, nor of how Western countries and France itself have done absolutely nothing to make Kiev comply with them. Further, there was no mention of the many years of genocide against the peaceful residents of Donbass, which caused many human casualties and forced hundreds of thousands to seek refuge in Russia. And the two leaders agreed to continue contact at various levels on the issues touched on in the conversation. And we learned from the French media that the telephone call, which, as I said, comes across as extremely heated, lasted for 90 minutes. In other words, an hour and a half. That's some mighty call and a very, very tough one, with Putin taking an absolutely uncompromising line. Note that the Russian demands are demilitarization and neutrality, and that the Russians have said that if Ukraine balks and delays in agreeing to these proposals and tries to spin out the negotiations, then the Russians reserve the right to escalate their demands. But that one way or the other, the special operation will be fulfilled, and it will be fulfilled by military means if necessary. Note also that Putin asked Macron to get the Ukrainians to facilitate the evacuation of Indian students from Kharkiv. There is a report circulating, I haven't seen it, that Prime Minister Modi of India called Putin and asked for Putin's help to get these Indian students freed. And we see that Putin took this up with Macron and badgered Macron to get this done, and that Macron agreed to take this up with the authorities in Kiev. And last but not least, we see that Putin took Macron heavily to task for some of the things Macron said over the course of his address to the nation. So we can see that the Russians are taking an absolutely uncompromising line. They're not prepared to bend an inch. They will see this thing through. They will make sure that at the conclusion, Ukraine is indeed a neutral state, that it becomes demilitarized, and that it becomes, as they would say, cleansed of the elements that make up this right-wing movement, which, as I said, for all the well-known reasons I'm not going to name on this channel. So that was a ferocious conversation. One wonders exactly what Macron said in response, but clearly Putin was not compromising in any way. And I would add that there is some evidence that the Ukrainians themselves are feeling the pressure. Now, a Ukrainian delegation is in Belarus, and they are negotiating at the moment with the Russians. As I said, from Putin's call, it's clear that the Russians are taking an uncompromising stand. But quite apart from that, apparently Zelensky held a press conference yesterday on Thursday morning, this morning, and according to the Financial Times, he appeared exhausted and unshaven, sat on a stool in a press conference room of his presidential office in Kiev. The staff inside and outside the building erected barricades and other fortifications ahead of a possible Russian onslaught into Kiev. It gives the impression of a man far from Napoleon, if you like, rather of a man very much at the end of his tether. And I'm going to say straight away that I feel extremely sorry for him, personally. I think that he's found himself in a situation he was not trained or prepared for. And from the Financial Times summary of what he said, which, by the way, comes across as extremely incoherent, it also seems clear to me that he was, again, very bitter about the West, made it fairly clear that he feels that the West has let Ukraine badly down. So that was the contrast, if you like, between an implacable Putin talking to Macron and a exhausted and unshaven Zelensky meeting the Western media in Kiev. One other person also met the Western media, and that was the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. Now, the Russian Foreign Ministry website has been up and down, and at the moment it's down, so I'm not able to get an exact account of what he said, but there is a fair amount available, and the Russian news agency TASS has provided a summary, and it quotes Lavrov as saying that Russia is confident that the situation around Ukraine will be resolved. A solution will certainly be found. I have no doubt about it. The conditions we view as a minimum are no secret. Moscow is ready to hold talks with Kiev, but will continue the military operation because it can't let Ukraine keep infrastructure facilities that threaten Russia. Demilitarization in this sense will be completed even if we sign a peace agreement. This agreement will certainly include such a paragraph. It is too early to assess the Russian operation and Russian-Ukrainian talks, but Moscow is confident that it is doing the right thing. And Lavrov apparently advised the foreign media to put aside emotion and to be guided by facts. He said, or he's quoted by TASS as saying, "I urge you to assess facts rather than pretend that it is some Hollywood action movie where there is an absolute evil and an absolute good." And then he looked forward in future to the day when, after the resolution of this conflict, there will be better relations with the West. I am sure that this hysteria will fade away and our Western partners will get over it. We are always prepared for dialogue on the condition that it is based on equality and respect for each other's interests. And on talking about the sanctions, he said the current sanctions are some kind of a tax on independence, and the countries that barred their companies from working in Russia made the move under huge pressure. If they expect Russia to crawl under the bench and give in to someone's dictatorship, their expectations are wrong. In fact, they should remember our history. We have never made agreements under pressure. And he then made comparisons between the situation today and previous situations where other leaders, and he mentioned Napoleon and a certain Austrian gentleman, whose name again, for all the usual reasons I'm not going to quote, and he said that they tried to do the same thing like the United States is doing, which is dominate Europe. And he says, he's quoted to say, I have comparisons to make. At some point, Napoleon and the Austrian gentleman tried to subjugate Europe. Now it is dominated by the United States. It is clear that NATO has no questions about it, and the EU knows its place. And that, it seems to me, is an implicit warning that eventually this structure in Europe will go the same way as the systems previously constructed by Napoleon and that Austrian gentleman if this conflict continues in the way that it is. And he also made comments about World War III and the rest, which I'm not going to discuss because, to my mind, they don't actually add anything substantive. I would add that the Russian intelligence chief Sergei Naryshkin made all kinds of claims today also about Ukraine having definite plans to acquire nuclear weapons. Well, I have to say straight away that I'm very cynical about those claims, very skeptical about them. Naryshkin, as far as I could see, came up with no evidence. Obviously, there is a media information war, and I would regard those comments as part of that until such time as I see proof, which I haven't seen of that up to now. So there we are. Russians are absolutely implacable. They appear to believe that they have the situation in their domestic economy fully under control. They're not worried about the sanctions. They don't seem to be fazed even by some of the energy sanctions that are being talked about. They will see this thing through to the end, and they are convinced that once the situation in Ukraine is resolved as they wish, sooner or later, the West will eventually come round and accept it. So that's where we are. Now, will the Ukrainians back down? Because that's what the Russians are asking them to do. That's what the Russian demands are. The Russians are basically saying, we're now closing in on Mariupol. We've surrounded your army in the Donbass. The West isn't helping you in any real way. They're piling up weapons in Poland, but these are not really going to help you very much. There's a few so-called volunteers coming, 300 from Croatia apparently, but that's not going to make any difference to the actual conflict. Our army is parked outside Kiev, ready to strike. Your army is surrounded far away in the Donbass. You must now sign on the dotted line and come to terms. If you don't, we will escalate our demands. And if you don't agree, then sooner or later, that massive strike force that is being gathered outside Kiev will presumably go into action. That, it seems to me, is what the Russians are saying. And they've said it to the Ukrainians, they're saying it to the Ukrainians, and Putin spelled it out clearly to Macron. Will the Ukrainians agree? Well, that remains to be seen. It seems to me that far too much now depends on the actions of Zelensky, the man who the Financial Times described as exhausted, appearing exhausted and unshaven, and sitting on a stool in a press conference room of his presidential office. It doesn't seem to me as if he has any real control of the situation or any real grasp of what to do. He is not trained in politics. He's no very great experience or background in politics. He's caught in this titanic struggle, and whether he will make the correct judgments, we will see. Now, almost certainly, there are other actors also at play. I'm sure that the Chinese are quietly speaking to the Ukrainians, urging them to come to terms. We know for a fact, because that Lukashenko has described at great length a long conversation he had with Zelensky a couple of days ago, in which he finally persuades Zelensky to send his delegation to negotiate with the Russians in Belarus. So, no doubt there are all sorts of other third parties involved in these discussions. And I would say that despite the hard line that so many people in the West are taking, you would suppose that with oil prices, the price of oil now approaching its historic peaks of 2008, at a time of already elevated inflation, with food prices also rising, you would have thought that leaders in the West would also, at this point in time, want to start looking for some way out, looking for some way of resolving this crisis, and would be advising Zelensky accordingly. We learned that Macron has in fact spoken to Zelensky. The Interfax report says that earlier on Thursday, the BFM TV channel reported, citing the Elysee Palace, that Macron spoke by telephone with Putin and then with Zelensky. So he called Zelensky directly after this call. One would have thought, one would assume that Western leaders, in their own interests and in the interests of their own people, would also be looking for a diplomatic solution to this conflict. Whether they actually are, however, I don't know. I'm afraid I am very skeptical and rather doubt it. Anyway, that's where we are. The Russians are giving, shall we say, negotiations. Let's not say peace, because there is no peace. Negotiations a chance. But their idea of negotiations is very much that they put demands and the Ukrainians accede to them. Will the Ukrainians agree? Will they refuse? Much will depend on it. I have no high expectations of any positive outcome. That, it seems to me, is where we stand as of today. I think we perhaps have the tomorrow and conceivably the weekend to see whether some kind of diplomatic settlement can be reached. Otherwise, I'm afraid I expect things to turn much more fierce over the next days following. Thank you for joining me again today. I remind you again, you can find us on our various other platforms, especially Rumble, Locals, also SuperU, ODYSEE and Library. And you can also obviously participate in our Locals channel and join us there and follow the exclusive content we publish there. And you can also support our work through Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying the things that you will find there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button, and please also remember to check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's my summary of the important events of today. As I said, I've not said much about the military situation, which is not really my province. More from me soon.